The sea in winter is a grey place. The sky above, the water below, the foam between, all shades of the same cold colour. For most of history, sailors understood winter as the season when ships stayed ashore. The North Atlantic, already temperamental in summer, becomes something else entirely when autumn fades. Storms arrive without warning. Ice forms on rigging. The distance between land and sea, between safety and danger, narrows to the width of wooden planks. Yet there were times when necessity demanded otherwise, when political urgency, delayed journeys, or vital messages required men to sail when all wisdom said to stop. In those moments, Vikings faced a problem that defined their nights at sea: how to sleep without fire in cold that could kill on a vessel that never stopped moving. This is the story of those nights, of the systems they built, the materials they trusted, and the warmth they shared. It unfolds slowly, as winter nights do, moving from the grey expanse of open water to the small enclosed space of a leather bag where a man might finally rest. There is no drama here, only ingenuity and endurance. No conflict, only the steady work of staying warm. Let the motion of the waves carry you. Let the rhythm of this story settle in. We begin where they began, on the open sea, when the decision to continue had already been made and the long night was approaching. The North Sea in late autumn holds temperatures that hover between freezing and just above. The air temperature might read 3 or 4 degrees Celsius, but that number tells only part of the story. Humidity pulls heat from the body faster than dry cold ever could. Wind compounds the loss. A person standing still in such conditions without proper shelter would begin to suffer hypothermia within hours. The North Atlantic extends this harshness further. The water itself remains near freezing year-round at depth, and surface temperatures in winter drop low enough that immersion means death within minutes. The waves are larger, the storms more frequent, the distances between safe harbours measured in days rather than hours. Vikings knew these waters intimately. Their culture developed around maritime capability. They built societies on islands, peninsulas and fjord-cut coastlines, where the sea was not barrier but highway. They understood the rhythms of the sailing season, the window from late spring to early autumn, when conditions allowed regular voyages for trade, raids, exploration and communication. The end of the sailing season came with the autumn equinox, sometimes extending into October if weather held. After that, ships were drawn onto beaches, turned upside down for hull inspection and repair, or stored in boathouses. Crews returned to farms. The sea became a place to avoid. Yet the sagas record winter crossings, men sailing when they should not have been sailing. These were not casual decisions. The risks were understood. The cold, the storms, the shortened daylight, the increased danger of navigational error. All of these made winter voyaging something undertaken only when the alternative was worse. The sagas preserve specific accounts of such desperate journeys. Egil's saga tells of men fleeing Norway in late autumn, driven by blood feuds that left them no choice but to risk the winter sea or face certain death on land. The voyage from western Norway to Iceland in winter meant crossing nearly 1,000 kilometres of open ocean with no landmarks, no shelter, and weather that could turn deadly within hours. Yet men made this crossing because the enemies behind them were more immediate than the cold ahead. Political exile provides one reason. A man fleeing enemies might have no choice but to sail immediately regardless of season. If remaining meant certain death and the nearest sanctuary lay across open water, then winter sailing became the lesser danger. The calculation was stark: possible death at sea versus certain death on land. For outlaws declared beyond the protection of law, for chieftains on the losing side of power struggles, for men whose honour demanded they leave rather than submit, the winter sea offered the only path forward. Trade emergencies provide another. A ship delayed by repairs or storms might find itself still at sea when winter arrived. The crew would face a choice: winter over in a foreign port, possibly hundreds of miles from home, or attempt the crossing with the knowledge that every day delayed made conditions worse. Wintering over meant months away from family, from farm work that needed doing, from responsibilities that could not wait. It meant depleting provisions intended for the voyage home, finding food and shelter in unfamiliar territory, risking illness in strange lands. For some crews, the calculation favoured attempting the crossing despite the season. Military necessity could also force the issue. a fleet recalled suddenly, a ruler demanding the presence of his men, a defence requiring immediate reinforcement. These are the pressures that override seasonal wisdom. When Harald Hardrada needed ships moved or warriors assembled in winter, the sea was crossed because royal command left no alternative. When defence of settlements required it, when alliance obligations demanded it, ships put to sea regardless of weather. There were also miscalculations. Crews who delayed departure too long, expecting one more week of favourable weather. Men who underestimated the speed with which autumn weather deteriorated into winter storms. Captains who gambled on making one final trading run before the season closed and found themselves caught by early winter. These were not heroes seeking glory, but ordinary sailors trapped by circumstance, forced to face conditions they would have preferred to avoid. The psychological weight of the decision cannot be understated. Every experienced sailor knew men who had not returned from winter voyages. Every coastal settlement had stories of ships that left in autumn storms and were never seen again. The sea in winter was not unknown territory. It was known, and that knowledge was frightening. Yet the decision was made. Provisions were loaded, families were left behind, and ships pushed away from shore into grey water under grey sky. For our purposes, the specific reason matters less than the reality. Men were at sea in winter. They would be there for days, possibly weeks. They would need to sleep, to rest, to maintain the strength required for sailing and navigation. And they would need to do so without the one element that defined warmth on land: fire. The grey decision then was already behind them. They had committed to the voyage. The ship was away from shore, surrounded by cold water under cold sky. The land they had left was no longer visible. The land they sought lay beyond the horizon, days away. There was no turning back. Wind and current made that impractical or impossible. There was only forward, into the cold, into the darkness that would come each evening. As afternoon gave way to evening, as the winter darkness came early, perhaps by mid-afternoon in the far north, the crew would turn their attention from sailing to survival. The work of preparing for night would begin. The urgency was real. Darkness would bring colder temperatures. The ability to see hazards would disappear. The ship would become a small island of humanity in vast darkness, and on that island men would need to create the conditions that would keep them alive until dawn. The longship beneath them was not a rigid structure. Modern ships, built with steel frames and welded plates, fight the sea with strength. They absorb wave energy through the solidity of their construction. A steel hull hitting a wave transfers that force through the entire frame, creating jarring impacts that can be felt from bow to stern. Viking longships operated on a different principle. They were built to flex, to move with the water rather than resist it. This flexibility began with the construction method itself, a technique called clinker building, where overlapping planks form the hull. In clinker construction, each plank overlaps the one below it, like roof shingles turned sideways. These planks were carved from split oak logs, each one perhaps 30 feet long, shaped with axes and adzes to achieve a consistent thickness and curve. The overlap between planks measured just a few inches, enough to provide strength while allowing movement. Iron rivets fastened the planks together, but not in a way that locked them rigid. The rivets passed through pre-drilled holes, with small iron washers or roves on the interior side that were hammered to secure the connection. This created joints that held the planks together, while still permitting the slight rotation and shift that flexibility required. The frame came after the hull. Unlike modern ship construction, where a skeleton of ribs is built first and planking applied to it, Viking shipwrights built shell first. They laid out the keel, raised the overlapping plank sides, and only then inserted the ribs, curved pieces of wood that reinforced the hull shape. These ribs were not fastened directly to the planks with rigid bolts. Instead, they were lashed as small cleats carved into the inner surface of the planks, using spruce roots or willow withies. These lashings held firm but allowed the flex to continue. The result was a hull that could twist along its length. If a wave lifted the bow while the stern remained in a trough, the entire ship would curve gently rather than stress its joints. If a wave approached from the side, the hull could flex to absorb the energy. This made longships remarkably seaworthy despite their open design. The deck boards, called tilia, were removable pine planks laid across the ribs. They were not permanently fastened. A crew could lift them to access the bilge for bailing or to stow cargo. During sleep, these boards became the mattress, the surface on which men would lie. The thinness of the hull meant that sleepers were extraordinarily close to the water. Longships were built with shallow drafts, often only 1 metre deep, to allow navigation up rivers and close approach to beaches. The keel extended below the bottom planks by perhaps half a metre. This meant the deck sat barely a metre above the waterline when the ship was loaded. A man lying on the tilia could hear the water directly beneath him. The slosh and gurgle of the bilge, the inevitable seepage that accumulated from spray and minor leaks, created a constant auditory reminder of proximity. The sea was not some distant element below decks. It was right there, inches away, separated only by overlapping oak planks sealed with tar and animal hair. This proximity might seem frightening, but for Vikings it represented connection rather than threat. They understood that their survival depended on the ship's ability to interact with the water. The flex, the movement, the slight give in every joint, these were not flaws but features. A rigid ship would eventually break. A flexible ship could survive storms that would destroy more solid construction. The motion of a flexing hull is distinct. It does not slam. It does not jar. When a wave passes beneath, the ship rises smoothly, the keel bending slightly upward, the sides twisting fractionally, and then settles back as the wave moves on. The sensation for someone lying on the deck is of constant gentle undulation. The floorboards beneath are never truly still, but neither are they violent. This becomes important for sleep. The human vestibular system, which governs balance and spatial orientation, can adapt to regular rhythmic motion. Once the pattern becomes familiar, rise, twist, settle, rise, twist, settle, the body learns to anticipate it. Muscles engage subtly even in sleep to maintain position. The rocking that might disturb someone new to ships becomes, for experienced sailors, a condition so normal that its absence would feel strange. The ship, then, was a living thing. It breathed with the waves. It flexed like muscle. It responded to force with give rather than resistance. And crucially for those who would sleep on it, it moved in patterns that the body could learn to trust. The creaking of the wood was constant. Friction between the overlapping planks, the slight rotation of rivets in their holes, the compression and release of lashings, all produced sound. This was not the silence of a modern vessel with rubber gaskets and welded joints. It was an ongoing conversation between wood and sea, between construction and environment. The rhythm of the creaking, like the rhythm of the rocking, became a form of reassurance. As long as the ship groaned in familiar patterns, experienced sailors knew the structure remained sound. At night, lying on the tilia with wool and leather between body and wood, a Viking sailor would feel every response of the ship. The lift and fall of swells, the twist as a wave passed at an angle, the subtle shift as wind pressure changed against the sail or tent. Far from being disturbing, this constant sensory feedback provided information. It told the sleeper that the ship was doing what it should, flexing, accommodating, surviving. The vessel was home in the most fundamental sense. It was the boundary between the sailor and a sea that would kill him if he entered it. It was shelter, however minimal. It was the platform for all his gear and supplies. And at night, when darkness made navigation impossible and the crew could only drift or lay to, it became bedroom. Understanding the ship's nature, its flexibility, its sounds, its movements, is essential to understanding how sleep was possible. The vessel was not fighting the sea. It was dancing with it. And those who slept aboard were participants in that dance, their bodies swaying with the rhythm, their trust placed in wood and craftsmanship, and the accumulated knowledge of generations. On land, the centre of Viking life was fire. The longhouse, the typical dwelling of a farming family or minor chieftain, was designed around the hearth. A long rectangular building with walls of turf, timber or stone, the longhouse contained a central fire pit that ran much of its length. This fire provided heat, light, and a place to cook. Smoke rose through openings in the roof. The warmth radiating from the burning wood made the structure habitable, even in the depths of Scandinavian winter. Benches lined the walls of the longhouse, raised platforms where people sat during the day and slept at night. Furs and blankets provided bedding. The proximity to the fire meant that even the coldest nights could be survived in relative comfort. The fire was also social centre, the place where family gathered, where stories were told, where food was shared. The glow of flames defined the space as human, civilized, safe. The hearth was more than functional necessity. It was the heart of the household in both literal and symbolic sense. The Norse word for family, HU, shares linguistic roots with words relating to hearth and dwelling. The fire was where children learned stories of their ancestors, where legal agreements were witnessed, where marriages were celebrated, where deaths were mourned. To be invited to sit by someone's fire was to be welcomed into their household. To be denied the fire was to be cast out, declared outlaw, removed from civilized society. The fire also marked the boundary between human space and the wild darkness beyond. At night, when the longhouse door was barred and the fire burned bright, the circle of light defined safety. Outside that circle was cold, danger, the unknown. The fire kept more than physical cold at bay. It kept psychological darkness away as well. The sounds of the night, wind, animals, the creaking of trees, remained outside the fire's protection. From earliest childhood, Vikings learned that fire meant survival. Maintaining the fire was sacred responsibility. It was never allowed to go completely out if it could be prevented. Banking the coals at night so the fire could be easily rekindled in morning was a skill taught early. Carrying fire from one place to another, preserving embers in clay vessels or in bundles of slow-burning material was essential knowledge. A household that let its fire die faced cold, darkness, and the dangerous, time-consuming work of creating new fire through friction or striking sparks. The rituals around fire reflected its importance. The hearth fire was often lit from fire taken from a respected neighbour or relative, creating symbolic continuity. At major festivals, old fires were extinguished and new ones lit ceremonially, marking transitions in the year. Fire was used in religious ceremonies, offerings were burned, oaths were sworn over flames, the gods themselves were invoked through fire's transformative power. At sea, all of this was impossible. A longship carried no hearth. The reasons were absolute and non-negotiable. Fire on a wooden vessel meant catastrophic risk. The ship's construction materials were inherently flammable. Oak and pine planks, dried during the building process, could ignite if exposed to sustained flame. The drying process that made the wood suitable for shipbuilding, removing moisture that would otherwise cause rot, also made it more susceptible to fire. The wood was not just flammable, but eager to burn once ignited. The caulking between planks, a mixture of animal hair and tar, was particularly vulnerable. Stockholm tar, rendered from pine wood through a process of burning and collecting resin, was used throughout the ship. It sealed gaps, waterproofed joints, and preserved wood against rot and marine organisms. It was also highly combustible. The tar-soaked wool and hair packed between planks would act as kindling once ignited, allowing fire to spread along the seams of the entire hull. The sail added another layer of danger. Viking sails were woven from wool, typically in a twill pattern that created dense, wind-catching fabric. While wool itself is somewhat flame-resistant compared to plant fibres, wool tends to char and smoulder rather than burst into flame. A sail was enormous. A full-size longship sail might be 15 metres wide and 12 metres tall, containing thousands of square feet of fabric. Any spark drifting upward could catch in its folds. A burning sail would be catastrophic in multiple ways. The immediate danger was falling flaming material. As fire consumed the sail, burning pieces would drop onto the deck, onto the crew, onto other flammable materials. The sail was also under tension, held by ropes and spars. As fire weakened the fabric, that tension could cause it to tear suddenly, bringing down the yard and possibly the mast itself, crushing anyone beneath. Rope, too, was flammable and essential. Hemp and flax were common rope materials, both of which would burn readily once ignited. The rigging that held the sail, the lines used to secure cargo, the lashings that bound oars and gear, all were vulnerable. A ship's rigging was complex, with dozens or hundreds of individual lines, each serving a specific purpose. Fire spreading through the rigging would disable the ship's ability to control the sail, to steer effectively, to function. The most horrifying aspect of shipboard fire was the absence of escape. On land, a house fire allowed people to flee. They might lose their home and possessions, but they could run to safety. At sea, there was nowhere to run. The water surrounding the ship was not refuge, it was death sentence. In winter, water temperatures meant survival time was measured in minutes. Even strong swimmers would succumb to cold water shock and hypothermia almost immediately. The Norse knew stories of ships that had burned. While rare, fire was too dangerous to risk, so it was avoided with extreme caution. When it happened, the results were devastating. A ship that caught fire in harbour might be saved by crew quickly going overboard and pushing it away from other vessels, accepting the loss of one ship to save others. A ship that caught fire at sea burned with everyone aboard. The speed of fire in a wooden vessel soaked with tar with hemp ropes and wool sails was terrifying. Minutes could mean the difference between containment and catastrophe. For all these reasons, open flame aboard a longship was absolutely forbidden. No cook fire, regardless of how carefully it might be tended. No lanterns with exposed wicks, despite the usefulness of light. No brazier for warmth, no matter how cold the night. The prohibition was total and unquestioned. The one element that defined survival on land, that marked the boundary between human and wild, between safety and danger, was the element that could not be allowed at sea. This created profound psychological challenge, perhaps more significant than the physical challenges it imposed. The prohibition meant not just adapting to cold and darkness, but adapting to the absence of the thing that had always meant safety and civilization. Without fire, there was no light once darkness fell. Humans are diurnal creatures. Our eyes are optimized for daylight. Our circadian rhythms align with day and night cycles. Our psychological comfort is tied to ability to see our surroundings. Darkness triggers instinctive anxiety. It is when predators hunt, when hazards become invisible, when the familiar becomes strange. On land, fire pushed back the darkness. The longhouse at night was dim compared to daylight, but the fire's glow allowed people to see each other, to navigate the space, to maintain activity into evening hours. The fire's presence meant darkness was partial, controlled, manageable. Aboard the winter longship, darkness when it came was absolute. Without moon or stars, and winter skies in the North Atlantic were often clouded, the darkness inside the tent was total. A hand held before the face was invisible. The tent fabric blocked what little light might exist outside. Men existed in complete blackness for hours at a time. This darkness required psychological adjustment. The initial instinct was anxiety, the animal brain warning that blindness equals vulnerability. But prolonged exposure to darkness without actual danger eventually taught a different response. The darkness became familiar. Men learned to navigate by touch and memory. They learned to identify each other by voice. They learned that darkness itself was not dangerous, only the things darkness might conceal, and aboard ship, the tent's enclosure meant no new threats could enter unseen. The absence of fire also removed the social centre. On land, people gathered around the hearth. Conversations happened near the fire. Work that required fine manipulation, sewing, carving, tool repair, was done by firelight. The fire provided focus, a place for attention to rest, a gathering, point that organised social space. Aboard ship at night there was no such centre. The crew was distributed across the sleeping area, each man in his own hoodfat or sharing with another. Conversation in the dark was disembodied, voices without faces coming from all directions. There was no focal point, no fire to stare into during pauses in talk. This lack of centre made social interaction different, more intimate in some ways, voices quiet in darkness, words chosen more carefully, but also more isolating. The fire's absence changed the sensory environment entirely. Fire produces sound, crackling, popping, the hiss of green wood or damp fuel. These sounds are comforting, associated with warmth and safety. Fire produces smell, wood smoke, the particular scent of different burning materials. Fire produces movement, flickering light, dancing shadows, the constant small drama of flames rising and falling. All of this sensory richness was absent at sea. Without fire, there was also no cooking, no transformation of food through heat. On land, raw ingredients became meals through fire's agency. Meat was roasted, stews were boiled, bread was baked. The smell of cooking food, the taste of hot meals, the comfort of warm liquid in the belly, all were tied to fire. At sea, food was cold. It was chewed but not transformed. The satisfaction was purely caloric, not gustatory or emotional. This added to the sense of deprivation, of being removed from normal human comfort. The shift from fire-centred to fire-forbidden existence required conscious acceptance rather than gradual adaptation. It was not something that happened naturally. It required Vikings to override deep instincts, to accept conditions that felt wrong on fundamental level. The cold, the darkness, the inability to cook, the absence of the thing that had always meant civilization and safety, all had to be accepted as necessary, as the price of sea travel in winter. This acceptance was taught culturally. Young men going to sea for the first time would be instructed by experienced sailors. The prohibition against fire would be explained. The reasons would be made clear, not through abstract discussion but through concrete examples. You see how the tar glistens on these planks? One spark and the whole ship is aflame. You see these ropes? Fire would consume them before you could react. The ship would be uncontrollable and we would burn or drown. The instruction was direct, memorable, designed to create visceral understanding rather than mere intellectual knowledge. The prohibition was also enforced socially. Any man who suggested lighting even a small fire, who treated the rule casually, who failed to take the danger seriously, would be corrected immediately and forcefully by the crew. The safety of all depended on each person's absolute compliance. There was no tolerance for risk-taking or carelessness regarding fire. A man who endangered the ship through fire would be remembered, his reputation damaged, his future prospects for joining crews diminished. Yet the absence of fire did not mean absence of warmth or survival. The Vikings developed alternative strategies, and this is where the psychology becomes interesting. The challenge forced innovation and reliance on different resources. Unable to use fire, they had to understand insulation, wind dynamics, collective body heat, and material properties in ways that fire-dependent peoples did not. This created a different relationship with cold. Rather than fighting cold with heat, the fire-based strategy, they managed cold through prevention of heat loss. This is a fundamentally different approach. It requires understanding that the human body is already a heat source, that the problem is not generating heat but keeping it. This understanding shaped their entire system, the wool tent that stopped wind, the hud fat that trapped body heat, the communal sleeping that pulled warmth. Every element addressed heat conservation rather than heat creation. The psychological shift involved accepting that warmth would be minimal, that survival did not require comfort. On land, sitting by a hot fire, one could feel genuinely warm, skin hot to the touch, sweat forming from excess heat. At sea in winter, there was no such warmth. The best achievable state was not dangerously cold, a condition where core temperature remained stable but comfort was never reached. This required accepting a lower baseline of physical comfort, redefining warm enough to mean survivable, rather than pleasant. The darkness, too, required reframing. Unable to have light, Vikings learned to value rest and recovery more than evening activity. The long dark hours became recovery time. Sleep extended through 12 or 14 hours because there was nothing else to do, and the body needed the recovery after days of hard physical labour and cold. This pattern was different from land-based winter life, where firelight allowed activity into evening, but it had its own logic. The body recovered, stored energy, and prepared for the next day's work. The absence of the hearth's social centre was replaced by the proximity of the crew. Unable to gather around fire, men literally pressed together for warmth. The intimacy was physical rather than visual, bodies touching, warmth shared, breathing synchronized in the darkness. This created different but equally strong social bonds. Men who had shared cold nights at sea, who had literally kept each other alive through body heat, developed trust and loyalty that might exceed what firelit conversation created. There was also something equalizing about the darkness and cold. Without fire, without light, status markers disappeared. A chieftain in the dark was just another warm body, no more visible or central than anyone else. The democracy of the sleeping arrangement, everyone cold, everyone in similar hud fat, everyone contributing body heat, reinforced the relatively flat social structure of ship crews. The absent hearth removed hierarchy in ways that might not have been possible if fire had been present. The Vikings also developed rituals and practices that acknowledged the strangeness of fire-free existence. The first night at sea, the transition from land to ship was recognized as difficult. Experienced sailors would reassure new crew members. The first night is hardest. You will miss the fire, but by the third night you will sleep. By the week's end, you will wonder how you ever needed it. This acknowledgement validated the difficulty while promising adaptation. The return to land, to fire, was also significant. After days or weeks at sea, the first night back in a longhouse sleeping by a fire often felt overwhelming. The heat would seem excessive, almost uncomfortable after adaptation to cold. The light would make sleep difficult, eyes had adjusted to darkness. Some sailors reported preferring to sleep outside their first night back, finding the longhouse too warm, too bright, too closed in after the open ship and tent. This suggests that the adaptation to fire-free existence was real and thorough. It was not simply endurance or suffering through necessary hardship. It was genuine psychological and physiological adjustment to different conditions. The body learned new definitions of normal. The mind accepted new baseline conditions. What initially seemed impossible became, through repetition and necessity, simply how life was lived at sea. The absent hearth, then, was not merely practical constraint. It was fundamental reshaping of the environment and psychology of survival. It forced Vikings to develop sophisticated understanding of insulation, wind, moisture, and collective resources. It required accepting discomfort as normal, darkness as acceptable, cold as manageable. It created different social dynamics and different relationships with the body's capabilities. The transformation from fire-dependent to fire-forbidden was complete, and it made winter sea voyages possible. As the winter day began to fade, the character of activity aboard the ship changed. Daylight in these latitudes was short, perhaps 7 or 8 hours at its maximum, less as winter deepened towards solstice. Twilight came early, and full darkness followed soon after. If the ship was under sail, actively travelling, the crew would first make the decision about whether to continue through the night. Night sailing was possible if conditions were favourable, if the wind was steady, the stars visible for navigation, and the risk of encountering hazards low. But in winter, with storms more likely and visibility poor, the safer choice was often to heave to or drift. Heaving to is a technique where the sail is adjusted and the steering oar positioned so that the ship maintains position relative to the wind without making significant forward progress. The vessel will still move, but slowly, in a controlled manner that does not require constant attention. This allows the crew to rest while the ship remains safe. Once the decision to prepare for night was made, the work began. This was not a single task, but a sequence of actions, each building on the last, each contributing to the larger goal of creating a space where rest was possible. The first step was adjusting the sail. If wind conditions allowed, the sail might be partially lowered to reduce the pressure on the mast and rigging. A fully raised sail in overnight wind risked damage if a sudden gust struck. Lowering the yard, the horizontal spar from which the sail hung, made the ship more stable and freed the sailcloth for potential use as shelter. Next came the preparation of the tent structure. The tent, called the tjald in Old Norse, was a specialised piece of equipment carried specifically for overnight shelter. Its components included heavy woolen fabric, wooden support poles, and various ropes and ties for securing everything in place. The support system varied depending on the ship and the specific tjald design. Some ships had permanent carved crutches, wooden fittings mounted at intervals along the gunwales designed to hold poles. These crutches were often shaped decoratively, with dragon heads or other carved motifs, reflecting the Viking tendency to make even functional items aesthetically pleasing. The ridgepole was the central element. This was a long wooden spar, straight and strong, that would span the width of the ship and create the peak of the tent. Sometimes a dedicated ridgepole was carried. Other times the yardarm from the sail could serve double duty. The pole was lifted and positioned to rest on the crutches or supports, creating a horizontal line perhaps 2 to 3 metres above the deck. Raising this pole required coordination. A longship might be 10 metres wide at midships. The ridgepole had to span that distance while remaining level and stable. Several men would be involved, lifting, positioning, adjusting, until the pole sat securely in its supports. With the framework in place, the tent fabric could be deployed. The tjald itself was a massive piece of wool textile, woven specifically for this purpose. The weight was considerable, perhaps 50 kilograms or more for a full ship tent. It had been woven in panels and sewn together to create a long rectangle or trapezoid shape. The fabric was unfolded and spread over the ridgepole. This required care. Wool, this heavy and dense, did not flap easily in the wind, but it was unwieldy to handle. Men positioned along both sides of the ship would take sections of the fabric and begin draping it down toward the gunwales. The edges of the tent had reinforced sections with loops or grommets, places where ropes could be threaded through. These ropes were used to lash the tent to the gunwales and to adjust tension. The goal was to create a taut surface that would not sag excessively or flap in the wind, while still allowing enough give that sudden gusts would not tear the fabric or pull the supports loose. As the tent was secured, the transformation became visible. The open deck, exposed to wind and spray, began to acquire a roof. The heavy wool formed a triangular cross-section above the ship, an A-frame structure that shed wind to either side. The space beneath was still open at the ends, but the long tunnel created by the tent provided immediate relief from direct wind exposure. The sensation inside the tent was different from outside. Wind that had been a constant presence, pulling at clothes and hair, pressing against faces, suddenly diminished to a background sound. The air, while still cold, stopped moving with the same force. This stillness was the first critical achievement. The tent also provided psychological enclosure. The grey openness of sea and sky was replaced with a defined space. The heavy wool above created a ceiling. The sense of being outdoors shifted toward the sense of being indoors, however rudimentary. This perception mattered for mental state. A person feels more secure under cover than under open sky, regardless of the actual structural protection offered. The tent's acoustic properties became apparent as well. Wind noise, sharp and hissing in open air, became muffled. The heavy wool absorbed and diffused sound. Rain or sleet, when it struck the fabric, produced a soft pattering rather than the sharp sound of water hitting skin or wood. This sound dampening contributed to the restful quality of the space. The tent was not sealed. The ends of the ship remained open, allowing air circulation and preventing the build-up of stale air from the breathing of many men in an enclosed space. This was important for safety. A fully sealed tent with 15 or 20 men inside would quickly become oxygen depleted. The openness also allowed the watch crew to move freely, to check the sail and rigging, to respond to changing conditions. With the tent secured, attention turned to the deck surface itself. The tilia, the removable pine planks that formed the floor, were already in place for everyday use. But for sleeping, additional preparation was needed. Wood conducts heat. A body lying directly on wooden planks will lose warmth through conduction, as heat transfers from the warmer body to the cooler wood. This heat loss continues throughout the night, slowly draining the body's resources. To prevent this, an insulating layer was required. Furs and hides served this purpose. Reindeer hides were particularly valued for their insulating properties. Reindeer fur is hollow, each hair containing air pockets that trap warmth. A hide large enough to cover a section of deck provided both cushioning and thermal barrier. Sheepskins also worked, though they were less insulating than reindeer. The hides were laid out in sections, creating a continuous soft surface over the hard planks. Some men might also have had woven grass mats, thick layers of dried grass or heather bundled together. These provided cushioning and some insulation, though they were less effective in damp conditions than animal hides. The arrangement of these sleeping surfaces was communal. There was no privacy, no individual compartments. Men would sleep side by side in rows that ran perpendicular to the keel, their heads toward the centre line and feet toward the gunwales, or vice versa, depending on the roll direction that night. The proximity was intentional. Bodies close together share warmth, reducing the heat loss of the group as a whole. The shields, which during active sailing were hung along the outside of the gunwales for display, and to protect rowers from spray, now took on a different function. They were repositioned or left in place to act as windbreaks at deck level. The skjaldrim, the shield wall, became a physical barrier that prevented drafts from sweeping across the sleeping surface. Each shield overlapped slightly with its neighbour, creating a continuous barrier perhaps 1/2 metre tall. This raised the effective height of the ship's side, blocking the low-level wind that might otherwise flow across the deck. The shields also provided some protection from spray. Water thrown up by the bow or by waves hitting the hull would strike the shield faces rather than soaking the sleeping men. The setup was complete when every element was in place. Tent overhead providing windbreak and psychological enclosure, shields along the sides blocking drafts and spray, furs on the deck creating an insulated sleeping surface. The open boat had been transformed into a sheltered dormitory. It was not warm, not comfortable by modern standards, but it was survivable. The stage was set for the systems that would keep men alive through the cold night. To understand how Vikings survived without fire, one must understand wool, not just as warm fabric, but as biological technology with specific properties that emerge from its structure. The wool used by Vikings came from Norse sheep, breeds related to modern Icelandic and Norwegian spelsow. These sheep possessed a double-layered fleece that set them apart from modern commercial breeds. The outer layer consisted of long, coarse fibres called tog. These were straight, somewhat wiry, and naturally water-resistant due to their structure and high lanolin content. Water encountering these fibres would bead on the surface rather than soaking in immediately. The inner layer, called thell, was soft and fine. These fibres were short, crimpy, and trapped air effectively. The crimp, a natural three-dimensional waviness, meant the fibres did not pack tightly together. When spun into yarn or woven into fabric, this crimp created thousands of tiny air pockets between fibres. Air is an excellent insulator, conducting heat poorly. These trapped air pockets were the foundation of wool's warming capability. When Norse textile workers processed fleece, they often spun tog and thale together, creating yarn that combined water resistance with insulation. The resulting fabric, known as vadmal, had dual functionality crucial for maritime use. The weaving created additional protection. Vadmal was typically woven in tight twill patterns, a diagonal rib structure where threads interlace in a way that produces denser fabric than plain weave. Less space between threads meant less opportunity for air or water to penetrate. After weaving came fulling. The fabric was agitated in warm water, causing the scales on wool fibre surfaces to lock together. The fabric shrank and became denser. Fulled wool is windproof. Air cannot pass through it easily. This windproofing was essential. Without it, moving air would constantly strip away the warm layer of air that accumulated against skin. Importantly, Norse processing did not strip all lanolin from the wool. Modern commercial processing removes this natural oil because it makes fabric feel greasy and smell strong. But lanolin is hydrophobic. It repels water. Wool retaining its lanolin would shed rain and spray more effectively than thoroughly cleaned wool. The most remarkable property of wool is how it behaves when damp. Plant fibres like cotton or linen, when wet, lose most of their insulating value. The fibres swell and collapse, eliminating air pockets. Wet cotton against skin in cold weather accelerates hypothermia. Wool behaves differently. The fibre structure does not collapse when wet. The crimped fibres maintain their shape and continue to trap air pockets even when saturated. Wet wool retains roughly 80% of its dry insulating capability. For sailors in an environment where everything becomes damp from sea spray and condensation, this property meant survival. There is also a chemical dimension. Wool is hygroscopic. It absorbs water vapour from air. As water molecules bond to the keratin protein that forms the fibre, the process releases energy as heat. This is exothermic. When crew members' breath added moisture to the air inside the tent, the wool fabric absorbed it and warmed slightly in the process. The effect was subtle but real. The tent fabric, then, was not simply a barrier. It was windproof, preventing convective heat loss. It was water-resistant on the outer surface, shedding rain and spray. It absorbed moisture from the air, releasing small amounts of heat as it did so, and even when damp it continued to insulate effectively. Every property was essential. The Varafelder, the shaggy cloak, represented specialized application of these principles. During weaving, locks of unspun wool were knotted into the fabric, creating a surface that looked and functioned like fur. The projecting wool locks trapped an exceptionally thick layer of air. The texture also shed water more efficiently than flat fabric. Droplets would run down the shaggy exterior without penetrating to the base layer. For a sailor wearing wool tunic and trousers, wrapped in a wool cloak, sleeping under a wool tent, wool was not just clothing. It was the technology that replaced fire. The sheep that produced the fleece, the women who processed and spun and wove it, the accumulated knowledge about which processing techniques produced which properties. All of this created the material that made winter sea voyages survivable. The smell inside the tent would be strong. Lanolin has a distinctive waxy animal scent. Damp wool intensifies it. Add unwashed bodies and the organic smell becomes powerful. But to Vikings, these smells were familiar, associated with warmth and function. The smell of lanolin was the smell of protection. The smell of damp wool was the smell of insulation that continued working despite moisture. The Norse relationship with their sheep and their wool was intimate and essential. They raised specific breeds over centuries. They knew which fleeces provided the best hog and thell balance. They knew how much lanolin to leave in. They knew which weaving patterns were strongest and which fulling techniques created the most windproof fabric. This knowledge, transmitted through generations, was as important as any weapon or navigation skill. Without wool, without its specific combination of insulation, water resistance, moisture absorption, and continued function when wet, sleeping aboard a winter longship would have been impossible. The wisdom of wool was the wisdom that kept men alive when fire could not. The shields hung along the gunwales served multiple functions. During active sailing, they were practical equipment and martial display. At night, they became architectural elements that completed the shelter system. A Viking shield was typically round, roughly 80 to 90 centimetres in diameter. It was constructed from thin wooden planks, usually linden or pine, glued edge to edge and covered with leather. The centre had an iron boss, a dome-shaped piece that protected the hand gripping the shield. The rim might be reinforced with leather or iron bands. The choice of wood mattered. Linden was preferred because it was light yet strong, and it had a tendency to absorb impacts rather than splinter catastrophically. Pine was more readily available in Scandinavia and served adequately, though it was slightly heavier. The planks were typically cut radially from logs, sliced from centre outward, which gave them greater strength than tangentially cut boards. These shields were relatively light, perhaps 3 to 5 kilograms, light enough to be wielded in combat for extended periods, but substantial enough to provide protection. The wood was thin, perhaps 6 to 8 millimetres at the centre, slightly thicker near the edges where the planks joined. This thinness made shields vulnerable to splitting under heavy blows, but it kept weight manageable and made the shields flexible enough to absorb impacts without shattering. The leather covering was typically cowhide, though sealskin was used where available. The hide was soaked, stretched over the wooden base while wet, and allowed to dry. As it dried, it shrank and tightened, creating a drum-like tension across the shield face. This leather served multiple purposes. It held the wooden planks together even if the glue failed. It provided additional impact resistance, and it created a surface that could be painted with designs identifying the owner or his allegiance. Aboard ship, the shields were hung over the side, overlapping like scales. Each shield's edge covered part of the next shield in the line, typically by about 10 to 15 centimetres. This overlap was carefully managed. Too much meant excessive weight concentrated on a few mounting points, too little left gaps. Iron or wooden clips attached to the gunwale held them in position. These clips were often simple hooks or loops that the shield rim rested in, allowing shields to be quickly removed if needed. The arrangement created a continuous wall of wood and leather extending above the ship's side. When fully deployed, a longship might have 30 or more shields along each side, creating a colourful display that served both practical and psychological purposes. Enemies seeing a ship with a full shield wall knew they faced a well-equipped crew. During the day, this arrangement served multiple purposes. Wind and spray that would otherwise blow across the deck hit the shield wall instead. Water ran down the curved surfaces rather than soaking crew or cargo. The angle of the shields, tilted slightly outward from the ship's side, encouraged water to sheet downward and away. The shields also provided backrests for rowers sitting on their sea chests between strokes, a small comfort during long hours of rowing. In combat or when approaching potentially hostile shores, the shield wall served its primary defensive purpose. Arrows or thrown weapons would strike shields rather than crew. The overlapping arrangement meant that even if one shield was damaged or penetrated, the shields beside it provided backup protection. At night, with the tent erected overhead, the shields took on their shelter function. They became the lower walls of the sleeping enclosure. The tent provided overhead protection from wind and rain. The shields provided side protection from wind and spray at deck level. Together, they created an enclosed space that was dramatically different from the exposed deck. The height of the shield wall mattered significantly. Extended roughly 40 centimetres above the gunwale, the upper edge of the ship's side, this raised barrier prevented drafts from sweeping directly across the deck at the level where men would be lying. Cold air, being denser than warm air, sinks and flows along surfaces like water. Even inside the tent, without the shields, cold air would flow across the deck surface, constantly stealing heat from sleeping men. The shields disrupted this flow, forcing the cold air to go over the top of the shield wall rather than across the sleeping surface, creating a zone of relatively stiller air at sleeping height. The overlapping arrangement prevented gaps where wind could penetrate. Wind encountering a barrier will find any opening and accelerate through it. The venturi effect creates jets of fast-moving cold air through any gap. Shields with spaces between them would create these cold air jets that could make sleep nearly impossible. The overlapped edges eliminated these gaps. Wind hitting the shield wall was forced to travel either over the top under the bottom where it met the gunwale, or around the open ends of the tent. But it could not penetrate directly through at the level where men were sleeping. The positioning of shields could be adjusted based on wind direction. If wind was primarily from the port side, the port shields might be repositioned to provide more coverage, perhaps overlapped more heavily or angled differently. The crew had learned through experience how to optimize the shield arrangement for different conditions. The shields also provided psychological definition that mattered more than might be obvious. They marked the boundary between the protected sleeping area and the hostile sea beyond. A man lying on the deck would see the shield wall, not open water. He would see painted designs, familiar patterns, the backs of shields he had trained with and fought behind. This visual separation reinforced the sense of being in a defined, protected space rather than exposed on an open deck surrounded by endless grey water. The shields would accumulate moisture from spray and condensation. Leather facing would dampen, becoming darker, heavier. Wood would swell slightly as it absorbed water, which actually improved the fit between planks and made the shields more watertight. The paint, typically mineral-based pigments mixed with oil or egg, would darken when wet but remained intact. But unlike fabric, shields did not need to stay dry to function. A wet shield still provided a physical barrier. The moisture might even add slight weight, making the shields less likely to rattle in wind, reducing noise that might disturb sleepers. The sound of wind against shields was different from wind against fabric. Shields were rigid and did not flutter. Wind hitting them produced lower, more solid sounds, dull thuds when gusts struck directly, deep rumbles when wind curved around the edges. These sounds were less intrusive than the sharp snapping of loose fabric, contributing to the relatively calm acoustic environment inside the tent. Inside the enclosed space, the temperature would be slightly higher than outside. The difference was subtle, perhaps 1 to 3 degrees Celsius, but that margin mattered profoundly when starting temperatures were already near freezing. The crew's collective body heat, prevented from immediately dissipating by the tent and shields, would warm the interior air slightly. Without the shields, this warmed air would be constantly mixed with cold air flowing in at deck level. With the shields, the warmed air remained more stable, creating a slightly less hostile environment. The shields also reflected some radiant heat back toward the sleeping men. Wood is not a perfect reflector, but it returns some infrared radiation, rather than absorbing all of it. The shield wall, warmed slightly by proximity to bodies and by the air inside the tent, radiated some of this heat back inward. The effect was minimal, but measurable, another small contribution to the overall system of heat conservation. The arrangement also meant shields remained accessible for their primary purpose. If an emergency required them, another vessel spotted that might be hostile, a sudden storm requiring all hands to manage the sail, and requiring shields to be lashed down or moved to prevent them from being torn away, they could be quickly unclipped from their positions and grabbed. This dual-use aspect was essential. Ship equipment had to serve multiple purposes because space and weight were limited. The shields exemplified this principle perfectly. Weapons in combat, spray protection during sailing, and shelter walls during sleep. The care taken in positioning the shields reflected accumulated knowledge. Experienced crews knew exactly how to arrange them for maximum protection, with minimum interference. They knew which shields were most damaged and should be positioned in less critical spots. They knew how to secure the clips so shields would stay in place even in rough seas, but could still be quickly removed if needed. This knowledge was transmitted from experienced sailors to novices, part of the education that turned landsmen into seamen. At night's end, when the tent came down and the sleeping area was dismantled, the shields remained mounted or were adjusted for day sailing. The transformation from sleeping quarters back to working vessel happened in reverse. Tent folded and stowed, furs rolled up, shields checked and repositioned if needed. But during the dark hours, their role was clear and vital. They were walls, barriers, boundaries that helped contain the small amount of warmth the crew could generate and maintain, defining safe space in the midst of hostile cold. With tent and shields creating the larger enclosure, the focus turned to personal insulation and the sleeping surface itself. The deck boards conducted heat away from anything warm touching them. The body at 37 degrees Celsius is warmer than wood at ambient temperature. Heat flows from hot to cold, so continuous contact meant continuous heat loss. Animal hides provided the essential barrier. Reindeer hides were particularly effective. Reindeer fur has hollow hairs. Each shaft contains air chambers. This makes the fur extraordinarily light for its insulating value. Thousands of hollow hairs created thick insulation. A reindeer hide laid fur side up, transformed cold hard planks into a warm sleeping surface. Sheepskin served similar purpose where reindeer was unavailable. Dense wool still attached to leather backing provided both cushioning and warmth. The natural lanolin in sheepskin contributed water resistance. If condensation dripped from the tent, sheepskin would resist absorbing it. These hides were laid in sections across the ship's width, creating a continuous padded surface. Multiple hides arranged end to end covered the entire sleeping area beneath the tent. The result prevented direct contact between sleeping bodies and cold wood. The sailors positioned themselves in rows perpendicular to the keel. This orientation was practical. When a ship rolls side to side, unsecured objects slide. By lying across the width, sleepers could brace against the gunwales or against each other, preventing rolling into a heap. Personal clothing stayed on during sleep. Removing wool layers would mean losing accumulated warmth and facing the energy cost of rewarming them in morning. The sailors wore wool tunics as base layers against skin, wool trousers, thick wool socks. Over this, heavy wool cloaks. The Varafelder deserves specific attention. This shaggy cloak had locks of unspun wool knotted into the fabric during weaving, creating a surface resembling fur. The projecting locks trapped thick air layers, providing exceptional insulation. The texture shed water efficiently. Rain or spray would run down the shaggy exterior without penetrating underneath. The hud fat, the leather sleeping bag, provided the final enclosure. During daytime it served as sea chest, holding spare clothing and personal items. The leather exterior was sturdy enough to sit on, to protect contents from spray. At night the hud fat became bedding. The sailor would empty it. Spare clothing could become pillow or additional insulation. The bag would be spread on the furs covering the deck. Construction was straightforward but effective. Leather formed the outer shell, typically cowhide or sealskin. Cowhide was readily available, thick, durable, and reasonably water-resistant when treated with oil or fat. Sealskin was superior where obtainable, more flexible, more water-resistant, tougher. The interior was lined with fur or heavy wool. Fur from sheep, reindeer, or other animals provided excellent insulation when facing inward toward the sleeper. Dense hair trapped air, creating warmth. Wool lining was less expensive but still effective. The bag was sized to accommodate a man and his clothing layers. Some were large enough for 2 men to share, particularly in coldest conditions where shared body heat became essential. The opening could be cinched with drawstring or closed with leather flap, though complete sealing was avoided to allow breathing. When a sailor climbed into his hud fat, he created a sealed microenvironment. The small volume of air inside was easy for body heat to warm. The leather shell prevented warm air from escaping. The fur or wool lining provided insulation on all sides. The sailor, already wearing wool layers and wrapped in a cloak, now had multiple barriers between body and cold air outside. The system worked through layering. Each layer addressed specific heat loss modes. Clothing prevented conduction from skin. The cloak trapped air for insulation. The leather bag stopped convection and blocked wind. The fur lining provided the innermost insulation layer. Some men shared bags when temperatures were especially low. 2 people in one large hud fat meant less individual space but substantially more warmth. Bodies pressed together transferred heat directly. Combined heat output could raise interior temperature significantly. In coldest nights, sharing was not just comfortable but necessary for survival. With all layers in place, deck boards below, furs on boards, wool clothing on body, cloak wrapped around, leather bag enclosing all, the Viking sailor had created multiple barriers against heat loss. Each layer served its purpose. Together they made sleep possible in temperatures that would otherwise cause death within hours. Without fire to cook, the evening meal aboard ship was cold and preserved. But it served critical purpose, fueling the body's heat generation. Stockfish, dried cod, formed the dietary foundation. The fish had been gutted and hung on wooden racks called yell, exposed to freezing wind for weeks or months. Cold prevented decay while wind removed moisture. The result was fish that had lost most water weight but retained protein and nutrients. Stockfish was hard as wood. Aboard ship, preparation was labour-intensive. The dried fish was pounded with hammer or axe back to break tough fibres and make them chewable. The sound would ring across the deck, a regular part of evening routine. After pounding, fish could be torn into strips and chewed slowly. Jaw muscles ground the tough material repeatedly, gradually rehydrating it with saliva until it could be swallowed. This extended chewing generated heat. Muscular work produces warmth, and in cold conditions, every source mattered. The fish was nearly pure protein. Protein requires substantial energy to digest. The body must break complex molecules into amino acids, releasing heat as byproduct. This thermic effect means roughly 20 to 30% of protein calories are released as heat during digestion. For someone staying warm without external heat, this digestive warming was valuable. Stockfish was eaten with fat, sour butter or lard. Fat contains more than twice the calories per gram as protein or carbohydrate. In conditions where the body constantly burns energy to maintain temperature, fat provides concentrated, efficient fuel. Norse butter was usually soured, fermented slightly to preserve it. Fresh butter spoils quickly, but fermented butter with acidic environment remains edible for extended periods. The fermentation created tangy, strong flavour. Lard, rendered pork fat, was equally common. It needed no special preservation, remained solid at cool temperatures, provided concentrated calories. A sailor might eat stockfish with substantial fat, creating meals roughly 50% protein and 50% fat by calories. This combination created specific metabolic effects. The body, consuming mostly protein and fat with minimal carbohydrate, shifts metabolism toward using fat as primary fuel. This provides steady, sustained energy release over many hours rather than quick spike and crash. The internal fire, once lit by the evening meal, would burn slowly through the night. Hardtack supplemented fish and fat. Flat dry bread made from flour, water and salt, baked until moisture-free. It was hard enough to crack teeth if bitten directly. It needed softening by soaking or holding in mouth until saliva rehydrated it. Hardtack provided carbohydrates. Aged cheese offered additional protein and fat. Norse cheese from cow, sheep or goat milk was aged until it formed hard protective rind. This cheese could be sliced and eaten cold. For liquid, crew had sour whey or skyer. Whey is liquid, left after cheese making. Fermented lactic acid accumulates, preserving the liquid and giving it tart taste. Sour whey provided hydration and probiotics aiding digestion. Skyr, an Icelandic fermented dairy product similar to thick yogurt, served similar purposes. Water was stored in wooden casks. In winter, there was freezing risk, but constant ship motion helped prevent water from freezing solid. Water temperature was near freezing though. Drinking it lowered body temperature slightly. This was unavoidable. Dehydration is dangerous even in cold weather because thirst mechanism is suppressed. Water had to be consumed despite its temperature. The meal was eaten without ceremony. Each man retrieved his portion from common supplies. There was no table, no formal seating. Men sat on sea chests or deck, eating while the ship rocked. Conversation was minimal. Cold air discouraged extended talk, and chewing dense food occupied mouths. After eating, digestion began. The stomach and intestines broke down food, releasing nutrients into bloodstream. The liver processed nutrients, generating heat as it worked. The entire digestive system became internal heat source, raising core body temperature and maintaining it through hours ahead. The principle was straightforward. Vikings could not light external fire, but they could stoke internal furnaces. The fuel was food, the combustion was metabolism. The result was warmth that would keep them alive through the cold night. The meal was not enjoyable in gastronomic sense. It was dense, bland, cold, required effort to eat. But it was functional, providing energy the body needed to generate heat for 8 or 10 hours until dawn. A ship at sea required constant vigilance. Even anchored or drifting, even in the darkest hours, someone had to remain awake and alert. The watch system organised this responsibility, distributing the burden so all could rest in turns, while ensuring the ship was never left unattended. The crew was divided into groups. typically 3 or 4 watches depending on the size of the crew and the specific voyage. Each group would stand watch for a set period, then rest while others took over. A 4-watch system meant roughly 3 hours on duty followed by 9 hours off. A 3-watch system meant 4 hours on duty and 8 hours off. The exact timing varied with the season and latitude. Winter nights were long in northern waters, sometimes lasting 16 hours or more in the far north, requiring longer total watch periods to cover the darkness. The division of crew into watches was not arbitrary. The ship's captain or most experienced helmsman would organise the groups to ensure each watch had the necessary skills. Each watch needed at least one man with good navigation knowledge, someone who could read the stars and understand the ship's position. Each needed at least one experienced helmsman who could manage the steering oar in varying conditions. The younger or less experienced crew members would be distributed among the watches, paired with veterans who could guide them and catch mistakes before they became dangerous. The watch assignments were announced as darkness approached. Men learned whether they were on first watch, middle watch, or morning watch. The announcement was matter of fact, no different from any other duty assignment. There was no shirking of watch duty. Every man's safety depended on the vigilance of whoever was on watch, so everyone took the responsibility seriously. Those assigned to first watch remained dressed and active, ready to begin their duties immediately after the sleeping area was prepared. Those scheduled for later watches could begin preparing their sleeping positions, laying out their hood fat, claiming their spot on the furs. Watch duties were specific and had been refined over generations of maritime experience. One man took the steering oar, maintaining the ship's heading or drift pattern as conditions required. The helmsman's position was at the stern, usually on the starboard side where the steering oar was mounted. In winter darkness, he could not see far ahead, so he relied primarily on feel, the pressure of water against the rudder blade, the way the ship wanted to turn in the wind, how the swell pattern affected the vessel's motion. The steering oar was a large piece of wood, perhaps 4 or 5 meters long, with a broad blade at the bottom that extended into the water. It was mounted to the ship's side with a flexible joint that allowed it to pivot. The helmsman held the tiller, the upper part of the oar, and could angle it to make the rudder blade push against the water, turning the ship. In strong currents or winds, the pressure on the oar could be substantial, requiring real strength to hold course. In calmer conditions, only small adjustments were needed, but they were needed constantly. The helmsman could never simply set a course and leave it. The sea and wind were always changing, requiring continuous small corrections. If the ship was hove to, positioned to drift safely without making significant progress, the helmsman's job was to maintain that position. This meant keeping the sail and oar arranged so the ship stayed roughly perpendicular to the wind, presenting enough resistance to prevent being blown sideways, but not so much that the ship fought against the wind and stressed its structure. It was a delicate balance requiring attention and experience. Another watchman positioned himself where he could observe conditions. In ideal conditions, this might be at the bow, the highest point on the ship with the best view ahead. But in winter, with spray and wind, the bow was often too exposed. More commonly, the lookout would position himself amidships, where he could see in multiple directions while having some shelter from the tent's edge or from the shields. The lookout's job was to watch for anything that might affect the ship's safety. Visibility was limited in darkness. On a moonless night, he might see only a few dozen meters, but certain things could still be detected. The white foam of waves breaking over shallow rocks or a hidden reef would show as a pale line in the darkness. The darker silhouette of land against the slightly lighter sky. Even at night, the sky is typically lighter than land, especially if there is any cloud cover reflecting starlight. If other vessels were near, perhaps the sound of their hull cutting through water, or, very rarely, a light if the other ship was foolish enough to risk a lantern. More often, the lookout was listening rather than looking. Sound carries over water, sometimes for great distances. The crash of surf on a rocky coast could be heard long before the coast itself was visible. The sound of wind changing, the pitch rising or falling as a gust approached or passed, could warn of weather changes. The sound of the ship itself changing, the creaking altering its pattern, might indicate a problem developing in the structure. If the ship was near known hazards, the lookout might also use a lead line. This was a long rope with a weighted lead at the end, marked at intervals. By dropping it overboard and feeling when it hit bottom, the depth of water could be measured. This was less useful in deep ocean, but crucial when approaching shore or navigating through island passages where underwater rocks might lurk just beneath the surface. The watch also involved periodic inspection of the ship itself. One of the watchmen would walk the deck every hour or so, checking that everything remained secure. The tent lashings were inspected to ensure they held proper tension. Ropes can stretch or loosen, especially when wet, and a tent coming loose in strong wind could be dangerous. The shields along the gunwales were checked to ensure they remained firmly clipped in place. The sail, if raised, was examined for signs of excessive stress or developing tears. The bilge was also checked regularly. Water always accumulated in the bilge, from spray, from seepage through the joints between planks, from condensation. A small amount was normal and expected. But if the bilge level was rising faster than usual, it might indicate a leak that needed attention. The watchman would listen to the sound of bilge water sloshing. An experienced ear could estimate the amount by the sound alone. If it seemed excessive, he might lift a deck board to check visually, and if necessary begin bailing. Bailing was done with a wooden scoop or bucket, a simple tool but effective. The watchman would scoop water from the bilge and throw it overboard. In heavy seas, or if a leak had developed, this could be continuous work, exhausting but necessary. More often, a few minutes of bailing every hour or two was sufficient to keep the bilge at acceptable levels. The watch also monitored the weather. Changes in wind direction or strength needed to be recognised quickly. If wind was increasing, the sail might need to be lowered further, or the ship's position adjusted to prevent being driven off course or capsized by a sudden gust. If wind was dropping, the sail might need to be raised more to maintain steerage. Temperature changes could warn of weather fronts approaching. A sudden drop in temperature often preceded storms. These tasks were performed quietly and efficiently. The sleeping crew needed rest, and unnecessary noise would disturb them. Watchmen moved carefully, placing feet deliberately to minimize the sound of boots on deck boards. If they needed to communicate, they spoke in low voices, just loud enough for each other to hear, but not loud enough to wake the sleeping men in the tent. The watch maintained the peace of the night so others could sleep deeply. The watch also maintained a sense of time. Without clocks, time was estimated by star positions if visible, or by the experienced sailor's internal sense of how much time had passed. The North Star, Polaris, remained fixed while other stars wheeled around it. Knowing the star patterns and their positions at different times of night allowed rough timekeeping. The watchman would note when certain constellations reached certain positions, marking the passage of hours. The watch change occurred at the end of each period. The exact timing might be estimated by star positions if visible, or simply by the collective sense of experienced sailors about how much time had passed. The timing did not need to be precise. What mattered was that watches were roughly equal in length, and that everyone got sufficient rest. The man currently on watch would move to wake his replacement. This was done with care and courtesy. He would approach the sleeping man's position, kneel down and touch his shoulder gently while speaking his name quietly. The sleeper would surface from wherever sleep had taken him, sometimes quickly, sometimes taking a minute or more to fully wake. There was no rushing this process. A man woken too suddenly might be disoriented, and disorientation on a moving ship in darkness was dangerous. As the replacement woke and extracted himself from his sleeping bag, the current watchman would provide a brief update. Wind conditions, direction, and approximate strength. Any changes observed in the past watch. Weather fronts moving in, wind shifts, anything unusual. The ship's behaviour, whether it was drifting well or fighting against the conditions. Any concerns? Bilge water level, a rope that seemed to be stretching, anything that needed monitoring. This briefing was conducted in whispers, face to face, often with the two men crouching or sitting to avoid standing tall where wind would pull at them. The information was practical and essential. The new watchman needed to know what to expect and what to pay attention to. The conversation lasted only a minute or two, just enough to transfer necessary knowledge. Then came the transition. The man who'd been standing watch would move to the sleeping position that had just been vacated. This was the phenomenon of the hot bunk. The space was still warm from the previous occupant's body heat. The leather of the hud fat retained heat, as did the fur lining and the reindeer hide beneath. This residual warmth was a significant gift that made the transition to sleep faster and easier. The man coming off watch, who might have been cold from standing in the wind for 3 or 4 hours, would experience immediate relative comfort. His body would not have to spend energy warming a cold sleeping area from nothing. The warmth was already there, waiting. He could slide into the hudfat, arrange the opening, and begin settling towards sleep within minutes rather than shivering for a long period first. This efficiency meant he got more actual rest during his off-watch time. The new watchman would take his position, at the steering oar if that was his assigned role, or at the observation position if he was the lookout. His eyes would need time to adjust to the darkness. Coming from the slightly warmer, darker interior of the tent, his pupils would be dilated. Stepping into the cold night air, he would need several minutes before he could see as well as possible. Experienced sailors knew to close their eyes or look away from any light sources, even starlight, while still in the tent, preserving their night vision before taking their watch position. His body would protest the transition from warmth to cold, from rest to activity. The first minutes of a watch were often the most uncomfortable. Muscles were stiff from sleep. The cold hit with full force, but movement helped. Within a quarter hour of walking the deck, checking rigging, taking position at the oar, his body would have generated enough heat through activity to reach a new equilibrium. Not warm, but functional. This pattern continued through the night. First watch completed, second watch took over, second finished, third began. If there were 4 watches, the cycle continued. Each man served his vigil period, 3 or 4 hours of full alertness and responsibility, then returned to rest for his longer off-watch period. The system ensured continuous awareness while allowing everyone sufficient sleep to remain functional. The equality of the duty was important for morale and cohesion. Everyone stood watch. The ship owner or captain, if present, took his turn at the steering oar or as lookout. The most experienced sailors and the youngest crew members all participated. No one was exempt based on status. This shared burden reinforced the bonds between crew members. The man who guarded your sleep tonight would be sleeping tomorrow night while you guarded his. The reciprocity was absolute and built into the structure. There was also flexibility for circumstances. If weather worsened during a watch, the watchman might wake additional crew members to help manage the situation. If a storm required all hands to handle the sail or secure cargo, the entire crew would be roused regardless of whose watch it was. The watch system provided structure for normal conditions, but everyone understood that survival sometimes required abandoning the routine. The watch system also had a psychological dimension that went beyond practical safety. Knowing that someone was awake, alert, scanning for problems, allowed the sleeping crew to relax completely. They did not need to maintain partial awareness. They did not need to wake at every unusual sound, wondering if it signaled danger. They could surrender fully to sleep, trusting that if anything required their attention, the alarm would be raised. This trust was possible because the system was proven. It had been used for generations, tested across thousands of voyages in all conditions. Every man had stood watches on previous voyages. They knew from personal experience that the system worked, that watchmen took their responsibility seriously, that help would come if needed. This collective confidence in the system was as important as the physical practices themselves. It created the mental conditions that allowed deep, restorative sleep despite the cold, the motion, and the inherent dangers of being at sea in winter. After the meal, after watch assignments, as full darkness settled, men not on first watch moved to sleeping positions. The process was methodical, shaped by repetition across many voyages. Each sailor found his spot on furs covering the deck. His hudfat had been emptied and spread open. Spare clothing inside, perhaps second wool tunic, extra socks, could be rolled as pillow or spread as additional insulation. The leather bag awaited. The sailor sat at the bag's edge. He wore wool tunic and trousers, base layers staying on continuously. His thick wool cloak or verafelder remained wrapped around him. Removing layers would mean losing warmth. Only boots came off. Wet or damp leather boots against feet all night would cause heat loss and discomfort. Thick wool socks remained. He swung legs into the opening, then lay back while pulling leather sides up around his body. The interior, lined with fur or heavy wool, felt soft against wool clothing. Fur compressed slightly under his weight but maintained loft for continued insulation. Finding comfort required small adjustments. Rolled tunic positioned under head to support neck. Body angled slightly to relieve hip pressure. Knees bent slightly to ease lower back. Arms positioned where circulation would not be restricted. Minor movements everyone makes when settling for sleep. The bag's opening needed management. Some had drawstrings that could be loosely cinched. Others had leather flaps. The goal was not complete sealing, that would trap carbon dioxide and moisture, but minimizing the opening so warm air would not escape freely while cold rushed in. Inside the bag, enclosure sensation became pronounced. Leather walls were close, perhaps 30 centimeters from body to edge when lying flat. This tight space created personal micro-environment, separate from larger tent environment. The small trapped air volume began warming from body heat almost immediately. Temperature inside rose quickly. With warm air unable to escape easily, it accumulated. Leather exterior blocked wind. Fur interior provided insulation. The sailor's body, generating heat continuously through metabolism, warmed this small space. Within minutes, interior would be noticeably warmer than ambient tent air, perhaps 5 or even 10 degrees warmer. The smell inside was strong. Leather has distinctive earthy odour, especially when damp. Fur adds animal scent. Wool clothing, containing lanolin and sweat, contributed its own smell. Breath exhaled into enclosed space added moisture and faint food odour. The cumulative smell was pungent, organic, intense by modern standards. But to Vikings, these were simply smells of functional gear, worn and tested, the smell of survival. Sounds changed inside the bag. Leather walls muffled external noise slightly. Ship creaking became softer. Wind on tent diminished. The sailor's own breathing became more prominent, a rhythmic sound that could become meditative. Bilge water slosh remained audible, but gentler. Around him, other men were settling into bags or preparing to share. The crew slept in rows, bodies close, to left and right, shoulders nearly or actually touching through leather of adjacent bags. Proximity was deliberate. Each body generated heat. Many bodies close together collectively warmed shared tent space. Some men shared bags when conditions were coldest. 2 in 1 large hood fat meant less space but direct body-to-body heat transfer. They might lie back to back, creating long contact line where warmth flowed between them, or side by side, pressed together along body lengths. Combined heat output could raise shared bags' interior temperature significantly. Sharing was not just comfortable in extreme cold, it could be necessary for survival. As he lay in the bag, ship motion continued. Gentle rise and fall of swells, slight roll side to side, constant hull flexing. Motion transmitted through deck boards, through reindeer hide, through hood fat leather to his body. The rhythm was familiar from countless nights at sea. His body, already exhausted from the day, began synchronizing with the rocking. Sounds around him were equally familiar. Wood creaking as ship flexed, water sloshing in bilge, low thrum of wind against tent, breathing of the other men settling towards sleep. Some already slept, breathing deep and regular. Others still adjusted positions, shifted slightly, found comfort. These sounds became background texture, normal acoustic environment of sleeping ship. Cold that had been sharp when first lying down began diminishing. The hood fat was working. His body heat was warming space around him. Insulation prevented heat from escaping. Exhaustion from hours of cold exposure and physical labour began asserting itself. Muscles that had been tensed against cold all day gradually relaxed. Breathing slowed and deepened. Thoughts, which had focused on preparation tasks, began drifting into less purposeful patterns. The boundary between waking and sleeping blurred. Ship sounds, gentle motion, bag warmth, crew presence nearby. All combined to create conditions where rest became possible. Sleep approached gradually. No sudden drop into unconsciousness. Just slow fading of awareness. Gentle letting go of conscious thought. Inside the leather hood fat, inside the wool tent, inside the wooden ship, on the grey winter sea, he slept. The sleeping arrangement was fundamentally communal. No individual bunks, no private quarters, no walls between men. The crew slept together in close rows, bodies nearly touching, sharing enclosed tent space. This proximity served specific survival function. Each human body generates heat continuously through metabolism, food breakdown into energy, muscle operation, organ work. An average adult male at rest produces thermal energy equivalent to roughly a 100-watt light bulb. In isolation, this heat radiates outward in all directions, most lost to cold environment. When bodies are close together, heat loss physics change. Each person warms air immediately around themselves. When many people are in close proximity, they collectively warm shared airspace. Temperature in the centre of a tightly packed group is noticeably higher than at edges. This is social thermoregulation, collective warming through proximity. The crew arranged themselves to maximise this effect. Men lay in rows perpendicular to the keel, shoulders nearly or actually touching. Space between one hudfat and next was minimal, perhaps 10 or 20 centimetres at most, sometimes less. The sleeping area became a continuous mass of insulated bodies, each contributing to collective warmth. Men at edges, those along gunwales, were exposed to colder air on one side. Men in the centre had warm bodies on both sides. This created inequality, but it was understood and managed. Watch rotation meant positions shifted through night. A man at cold edge part of night would later move to warmer central position when watch changed and sleeping arrangements reorganised. Collective heat made measurable difference. Tent interior, when occupied by 15 or 20 men generating heat, would be several degrees warmer than exterior air. This temperature gain came entirely from biological heat production. Tent and shields prevented accumulated warmth from being immediately blown away by wind. The communal arrangement also provided safety function. If a man became dangerously cold during night, if hypothermia began, neighbours would likely notice. Hypothermia causes violent shivering in early stages, then confusion and lethargy as it progresses. A man sleeping alone might progress through these stages unobserved until condition became critical. A man sleeping pressed against others would be felt shivering. Distress would disturb those around him, prompting intervention before danger became fatal. This monitoring was not formal or deliberate. It was natural consequence of proximity. Bodies in contact are aware of each other. A violent shiver would be felt through leather of adjacent bags. Absence of movement for too long might be noticed. Crew functioned as its own early warning system. There was no awkwardness about this closeness. Viking culture did not attach the same meanings to male physical proximity that some later cultures developed. Men fought together, worked together, travelled together, slept together. Physical contact was normal, practical, necessary for survival. It required no explanation. Shared experience created bonds. Crews that had travelled together, that had pressed close for warmth through multiple cold nights, developed strong cohesion, intimacy of shared sleeping space, mutual dependence for survival, created trust extending beyond nighttime into all aspects of ship operation and Viking society more broadly. Breathing of many men sleeping together created its own acoustic signature. 15 or 20 people breathing in sleep produced rhythmic background sound. Some snored, rumbling resonating through quiet tent. Others breathed almost silently. Sounds overlapped, creating organic white noise that masked smaller disturbances and could itself become restful. Movement punctuated the night. A man shifting position, adjusting hudfat, repositioning an arm gone numb from restricted circulation. These movements sometimes disturbed neighbours briefly, triggering small chain reactions as men adjacent also adjusted. But disturbances were accepted as normal. Perfect stillness through night was not expected. The democratic nature of arrangement mattered for morale and social structure. Everyone shared same conditions. If captain or ship owner was present, he slept among crew in similar circumstances. No special bedding for higher status individuals, no private cabin where leaders could retreat. Whatever discomfort existed was universal. This equality reinforced social bonds that made crews effective and maintained relatively flat social structure of Viking ship crews. The principle was simple and observable. Together we are warmer than alone. This was not philosophy or abstract theory. It was measurable fact. The collective made possible what individuals could not achieve. The crew functioned as single heat-generating organism, each member contributing, each benefiting. The democracy of warmth was democracy of survival. Sound at sea differs from sound on land. Absence of solid terrain, presence of water in all directions, lack of structures to block or reflect sound, all create distinct acoustic environment. Aboard the Longship at night, the soundscape was specific, continuous, layered. The fundamental sound was water. Slosh and gurgle of bilge just beneath deck boards created liquid rhythm. Water had accumulated from spray over gunwales, from minor seepage through plank joints, from condensation dripping from cold tent fabric. Bilge never stayed completely dry. As ship moved with waves, water shifted, flowing toward bow when ship pitched forward, toward stern when it pitched back, sloshing side to side with each roll. Moving water sound is complex, containing multiple frequencies. High-pitched splash and trickle, lower-pitched slosh and gurgle. Water sounds tend to have calming effect on humans. They reduce stress markers and promote relaxation. Vikings did not understand neurological mechanisms, but they experienced the effect. Constant water sounds beneath deck were part of ship's voice, part of sonic environment defining nighttime at sea. Wood creaking was equally constant and defining. Clinker-built hull with overlapping planks held by iron rivets created friction points throughout structure. When ship flexed with waves, these points produced sound, planks rubbing against each other as they shifted microscopically, rivets rotating slightly in holes under stress, ribs pressing against cleats and lashings holding them to hull, all created creaks, groans, subtle popping sounds. These wood sounds were rhythmic but not perfectly regular. Each wave passing beneath the hull caused flexing. Each flex produced sound. But waves are not uniform, some larger, some smaller. Intervals between them vary. Creaking had rhythm and pattern but not precise beat. It was organic, changing, responsive to sea motion. Character of creaking provided information to experienced ears. Sailors learned distinguishing normal flex from excessive stress. Rhythmic, moderate creak indicated healthy movement, ship doing what it was designed to do. Loud crack or sustained groan might indicate joint taking excessive strain, warning of problem needing attention. Even in sleep, some consciousness part remained attuned to these sounds, ready to wake if pattern changed dramatically. Tent fabric added its own acoustic layer. Wind-striking heavy wool created low-frequency thrum, vibration felt as much as heard. Taut fabric acted like drum membrane, vibrating when struck by gusts. Rain or sleet hitting tent produced softer pattering than rain on hard surfaces. Thick wool absorbed much impact, muffling sharp sound into something gentler. Shields along gunwales contributed sound as well. Wind curling around these barriers created turbulence, producing low rushing or whooshing sounds. If shields were not perfectly secured, they might vibrate slightly in strong gusts, adding faint humming or buzzing to mix. Human sounds were constant throughout night. Breathing of sleeping men created background rhythm. Some snored, deep rumbling echoing through tent. Others breathed quietly, almost silently. Coughing, rustle of movement as someone shifted position, sound of man extracting himself from hood fat to relieve himself at ship's side. All normal sounds of people sleeping in close quarters. Watch crew added occasional sounds. Footsteps on deck were soft but audible. Boot leather contact against wooden planks. Creak of steering oar as helmsman adjusted course. Low voices if watchmen needed communicating briefly about conditions or decisions. These sounds were reassuring to those sleeping. Confirmation someone was awake, vigilant, maintaining safety. Occasionally, sounds from beyond immediate ship environment would penetrate. Seabirds calling in darkness if land was nearby. Splash of whale or dolphin surfacing. Sudden rush of water and breath briefly drawing attention before fading. Distant sound of waves breaking on shore if coast was close enough. These sounds were rare but distinctive. Acoustic isolation of being at sea meant human-made sounds from other sources were largely absent. No distant noise of other vessels, no sounds of settlement or human activity on land. Soundscape was almost entirely natural. Water, wind, wood, breath, occasional animal sounds. This removed one entire category of potential disturbance existing on land. This constant, relatively gentle acoustic environment promoted sleep. Rhythmic sounds created form of white noise masking sudden disturbances. Random noises that might wake someone in quiet environment were absorbed into ongoing sound of ship and sea, becoming just another texture element rather than jarring interruption. Familiarity of sounds also mattered significantly. For experienced sailors, these sounds were known and expected. Creaking, water, wind on wool, all were normal, safe, appropriate. Familiarity reduces stress response to sound. Sounds that might disturb or alarm someone new to ship life were, for Vikings, simply natural voice of their maritime environment, as normal as wind in trees would be to someone sleeping in a forest. The rhythm of sounds synchronized with rhythm of ship motion. Creak of wood corresponded to flecks caused by passing waves. Slosh of bilge water timed with ship's roll. Thrum of wind against tent varied with gusts. All these sounds were tied to ship's movement through water, creating unified sensory experience where motion and sound reinforced each other. There were also moments of relative silence, pauses between wave strikes, brief lulls when wind dropped, intervals between one creak and next. These silences were not complete. Background of water movement and breathing remained. But they created contrast, making sounds more noticeable when they resumed, establishing pattern of sound and near silence that had its own organic rhythm. The soundscape was not designed for pleasure or aesthetic enjoyment. It was simply acoustic reality of the environment, the way ship and sea and weather expressed themselves in sound. But it was not unpleasant. It was continuous without being jarring, rhythmic without being monotonous, varied without being chaotic. The Vikings learned to sleep within this soundscape, to accept it as the condition of maritime night, to find rest despite, or perhaps because of, the constant gentle noise that defined their sleeping hours. The night progressed in stages marked by watch changes. The rhythm of rotation, wake, serve, sleep, wake again, structured the dark hours. For those sleeping, night was not one continuous block of unconsciousness, but series of sleep periods interrupted by brief wakings and the distant awareness of movement and sound around them. Cold could cause brief waking. If a man shifted in his sleep and accidentally broke the seal of his sleeping bag, allowing cold air to rush in and displace the warm air he had accumulated, the sudden chill would bring him partially awake. The temperature difference was dramatic. The interior of a hudfat might be 10 degrees warmer than the air in the tent. When cold air suddenly replaced warm, the body's defensive response would pull the man toward wakefulness. He would quickly readjust the hudfat, pulling the opening closed again, drawing the leather flap or cinching the drawstring tighter. Then he would wait, still partially awake, feeling the cold space around him gradually warm again as his body heat rebuilt the microclimate. The leather itself would be cold now, having lost its warmth to the air that escaped. His breath would form visible clouds in the dark interior of the bag. But within 5 or 10 minutes warmth would return. His breathing would slow again. The edge of consciousness would blur. Sleep would reclaim him. The need to urinate was inevitable during long winter nights. The cold suppressed the thirst mechanism, but men still drank water with their evening meal, and the body continued processing fluids through the night. The bladder, full and pressing, would eventually create enough discomfort to pull a man from sleep. Rising to relieve oneself meant a complete disruption of the carefully maintained warmth. The man would have to extract himself from the hudfat, opening it fully, allowing all the accumulated warm air to escape. The cold would hit him immediately. He would have to sit up, pull his boots on if he had removed them, then stand and make his way to the ship's side. Inside the tent in full darkness, this navigation was done by feel and memory. He would know roughly where he was positioned relative to the tent poles, the shields, the other sleeping men. He would step carefully, avoiding the sleeping forms around him. If he stepped on someone accidentally, there would be muttered complaint or a shift of position, but rarely full waking. Everyone understood the necessity. At the ship's side, he would relieve himself over the gunwale or through a gap in the shields. The sound of urine hitting water far below would be clearly audible in the quiet night. The exposure to full wind outside the tent would be shocking after the relative shelter inside. The process would be quick. Returning to his sleeping position, he would find the hudfat cold. All the warmth had dissipated in the minutes he was gone. Climbing back in felt like starting over. The leather was cold against his legs. The fur lining had lost its warmth. He would lie there shivering, pulling the cloak tight around himself, waiting for his body heat to warm the space again. This could take 15 or 20 minutes, long enough to be genuinely uncomfortable. Some men would curl into tight balls to reduce the volume of air that needed warming. Eventually, slowly, warmth would return and sleep would become possible again. The watch changes created particular moments of awareness for everyone sleeping nearby. When a man's turn came, the person waking him would approach with deliberate sounds. Footsteps slightly heavier than necessary, a clearing of the throat, so the sleeper would begin surfacing before the actual touch. Then the touch on the shoulder, the name spoken quietly but clearly. the sleeper would surface from wherever sleep had taken him. Sometimes he would wake quickly, immediately aware of where he was and what was happening. Other times, especially if he'd been in deep sleep, he would wake slowly, confused for a moment, needing several seconds to remember he was on a ship, at sea, in winter, and it was his turn for watch. He would extract himself from the hood fat with reluctance, every instinct urging him to stay in the warmth. But duty was duty, and his own safety depended on others taking their watches seriously, so he would push through the reluctance. The cold air would hit him fully as he emerged from the bag. He would need to pull boots back onto feet that had warmed during sleep, making the cold leather even more noticeable. He would stand, shake off the last remnants of sleep, and prepare to take his position. The man he was relieving would brief him in whispers. These conversations were sometimes overheard by men sleeping nearby. A soft murmur of voices discussing wind direction, sea state, anything unusual observed. These sounds became part of the texture of night, not disturbing but present, a reminder that the watch system was functioning. Then the relieved watchman would gratefully move to the sleeping position just vacated. This space was still warm. The previous occupant's body heat remained in the leather of the hood fat, in the fur lining, in the reindeer hide beneath. This residual warmth was a significant gift that made the transition to sleep faster and easier. The man coming off watch, who might have been cold from standing in the wind for 3 or 4 hours, would experience immediate relative comfort sliding into the pre-warmed space. His body, which had been burning energy to stay warm during the watch, could now relax. The warmth was already there, requiring no effort to create. He could settle into the bag, arrange the opening, and begin drifting towards sleep within minutes. His breathing would slow, his muscles would relax, sleep would come quickly, his body desperate for the recovery time. This efficiency of warmth transfer meant the sleeping positions were continuously occupied through night. As one man rose, another took his place within minutes. The warmth was never allowed to fully dissipate. The collective heat of the crew was maintained and circulated through constant rotation. The system was elegant in its efficiency. No heat was wasted. Every man's body heat benefited someone else, either immediately or shortly thereafter. For some men, sleep came easily and deeply despite the disturbances. Exhaustion from days' physical labour, rowing for hours, adjusting sail repeatedly, maintaining the ship, preparing for night, created powerful drive toward rest. The body, depleted by hours of cold exposure and work, would shut down consciousness and focus entirely on recovery. These men might sleep through most of night with only vague awareness of their surroundings, waking only when directly roused for their watch. Their sleep would be profound, dropping quickly into the deeper stages where the body performed its most important recovery work. Dreams might come, though often they were forgotten upon waking. The motion of the ship, the sounds of water and wood, the cold air, all were processed by sleeping brains as normal, expected, safe. No alarm signals were triggered. The body remained relaxed even while maintaining the subtle muscular adjustments needed to stay positioned on the moving deck. For others, sleep was lighter and more fragmented. They remained more aware of the ship's sounds, the movements of crew around them, the cold pressing in from outside their hood fat. Their rest was real but less deep, characterized by periods of dozing rather than profound unconsciousness. They might wake several times through night, when someone nearby shifted position noisily, when the ship hit a particularly large wave and the motion changed briefly, when the cold penetrated deeply enough to create discomfort. These men would lie in their bags, half awake, listening to the night. They would hear the watch change conversations. They would notice when the wind changed direction or strength, even without fully waking. They would be aware of time passing, of the night lengthening, of waiting for their own watch turn or for dawn. Their rest was less restorative, but it was still rest, still better than remaining fully awake. The middle hours of night, period roughly between midnight and the hours before dawn, were often coldest. Whatever residual warmth day had provided was fully dissipated by then. The sun had been down for 8 or 10 hours, and new day's sun was still hours away. The air temperature would drop to its lowest point. The water temperature, already near freezing, seemed to radiate cold upward through the thin hull. These were hours when the insulation system faced its greatest test. The wool of the tent, the fur of the sleeping bags, the collective body heat of the crew, all were working at maximum to counteract the cold. Men who had been comfortable earlier in the night would begin to feel the chill penetrating their layers. Those at the edges of the sleeping group, exposed to colder air on one side, would feel it most acutely. Men would respond instinctively, even in sleep. Cloaks would be pulled tighter around bodies. The opening of the hudfat would be adjusted to be smaller, reducing air exchange but conserving more heat. Those sleeping close to others would unconsciously press closer, sharing warmth more directly. Knees would be drawn up toward chests, bodies curling into more compact positions to reduce surface area exposed to air. The watch crew outside the tent, fully exposed to the coldest hours, had to work harder to maintain warmth. They would move more frequently, walking the deck, checking and rechecking rigging, performing small tasks that generated body heat through muscular activity. They would stamp their feet periodically to maintain circulation. They would flex their hands, which tended to become numb when gripping the steering oar for extended periods in cold conditions. If the tent was positioned so the watch crew could duck inside periodically, they would do so, stepping into the relative warmth of the tent space for a minute or two, allowing their bodies to warm slightly before returning to their duties. This was not shirking. It was practical cold management that allowed them to remain alert and functional for their entire watch, rather than becoming dangerously hypothermic. The stars, visible to the watch crew through gaps in the tent or when they stepped outside it, wheeled slowly overhead. Their positions changed gradually as hours passed. The Great Bear rotated around Polaris. Orion rose in the east and climbed toward its zenith. The Pleiades marked their own arc across the sky. An experienced navigator could estimate time by these movements with reasonable accuracy, knowing how much of the night had elapsed and roughly how much remained until dawn. This knowledge provided psychological comfort to those on watch. The night was not endless, though in the coldest, darkest hours it could feel that way. The stars proved that time was passing, that the wheel was turning, that dawn would eventually come. This certainty helped maintain morale during the hardest hours. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, darkness began to thin. The change was not sudden or obvious. There was no moment when one could point and say, now it is getting lighter. Instead, over the course of perhaps 30 or 40 minutes, the quality of darkness shifted. The absolute blackness of deep night, the darkness where even familiar shapes became invisible beyond arm's length, gave way to a slightly less absolute darkness, where the largest shapes could just barely be distinguished. The stars began to fade, the brightest ones lingering longest. The eastern horizon, though often obscured by clouds in winter, began showing the first hint of pre-dawn grey. Not light, not yet, but a lightening of the dark, charcoal grey instead of black. The watch crew noticed this change first. The man at the steering oar would see it in the way the sail became barely visible against the sky instead of completely invisible. The lookout would notice he could see the shields along the gunwale as dark lines instead of nothing at all. These were subtle changes, but to men who had been staring into darkness for hours, they were significant and welcome. The transition from night to morning watch often coincided with these early signs of approaching dawn. The man taking morning watch knew that his vigil would end not in darkness, but in growing light, and this knowledge provided comfort. The hardest part of the night, the coldest, darkest hours, was passing. Day would return. The sun, though it would provide little warmth in winter, would at least provide light. The grey world would become visible again, but dawn in winter was slow. The grey light came gradually, sometimes taking an hour or more to transition from darkness to what could properly be called daylight. During this long transition, the temperature often dropped further. This seems counterintuitive. One expects approaching dawn to bring warming. But in winter, the coldest moments of the entire night often came just before and just after sunrise, as if the darkness gathered its strength for one final assault before retreating. Meteorologically, this happens because the Earth has been radiating heat into space all night without receiving any solar radiation in return. The air temperature continues dropping until the sun rises above the horizon and begins adding energy back into the system. This means the hour before dawn and the hour after can be colder than midnight. The sleeping crew, deep in their hudfat, were partially protected from this pre-dawn cold by their layers of insulation, but they felt it nonetheless. The chill penetrated even wool and fur and leather. Men would stir in their sleep, pulling coverings tighter, curling into more compact positions. Some would wake briefly, register the cold, perhaps shift position to find a warmer spot or press closer to a neighbour, then fade back into sleep. Those on morning watch felt the cold most acutely. They were fully exposed, active, unable to huddle for warmth. They maintained their vigilance, but it required effort and discipline. The temptation to abandon watch and seek warmth was real, but training and mutual dependence prevented it. They knew the sleeping crew trusted them. They knew their own safety depended on others maintaining the same vigilance when it was their turn to sleep. So they endured, and they watched, and they waited for the call to wake the crew and begin the new day. The sleeping men waited too, unconsciously, their bodies and minds preparing for the transition from night to day, from sleep to waking, from the horizontal world of rest to the vertical world of work. The night was ending. The system had worked. They had survived another cold, dark stretch. Soon the call would come, and the cycle would begin again. Morning watch would be ones to wake crew. As grey light began penetrating heavy wool of tent, as stars faded completely from view, decision would be made that night was over, and day's work should begin. Waking process was gradual and relatively gentle. Watch would move through sleeping area, touching shoulders, speaking names quietly. Each man would wake in his own time, some rising quickly, alert almost immediately, others taking long minutes to surface from deep sleep. There was no particular urgency unless conditions demanded it. Waking was allowed to happen at natural pace. First sensation on waking was cold. Whatever warmth had been maintained through night inside sleeping bag was lost. Moment Hudfat was opened. Cold air rushed in, displacing warm air that had been trapped around body. Contrast was sharp and unpleasant, from relative comfort to acute cold within seconds. Emerging from bag required overcoming strong instinct. Every part of body urged staying inside, clinging to residual warmth. But day's work required movement. Ship needed preparing for sailing. Men forced themselves to sit up, to swing legs out of bag, to pull cold boots back onto feet. Boots, which had been removed night before, were stiff from cold, and sometimes damp from condensation or spray that had found its way to where they were stored. Putting them on was uncomfortable. Cold leather against wool-clad feet, stiffness that made lacing or buckling more difficult. But boots were necessary. Moving about deck without them risked injury and increased heat loss through feet. Hudfat needed packing away. Each man would roll or fold his sleeping bag. Leather was cold and stiff, resisting folding, but handling gradually made it more pliable. Spare clothes that had been used as pillow or additional insulation were packed back inside. Hudfat transformed from bed back into sea chest, ready to serve daytime function as storage and seating. Furs and hides that had covered deck were also rolled and stowed. These needed protection from spray during day's sailing, so they were placed in relatively sheltered locations, perhaps in space beneath rowers' benches or covered with canvas. Deck boards remained in place, ready for crew to walk on as they worked. Tent came down through coordinated effort. Lashings that had held wool fabric to gunwales were untied. Men positioned on both sides of ship would grasp fabric and lift it off ridgepole. Wool was heavy, especially if damp from night of accumulated condensation. Fabric had to be folded carefully to avoid tearing it. Ridgepole was then lowered from supports. If ridgepole had been yardarm, spar that held sail, it would be raised again shortly to position sail for day. If it was dedicated tent pole, it would be secured somewhere on deck where it would not interfere with sailing operations, but where it would be accessible for next night's use. Shields remained on gunwales or were repositioned for day sailing. During active sailing, they would continue providing protection against spray. Their position might be adjusted depending on which side was more exposed to wind and waves, but generally they stayed mounted where they had been during night. Morning meal was similar to evening meal, cold food from preserved stores, more stockfish, more butter, more hardtack, water from casks that was still near freezing temperature. Active eating helped begin warming body as digestion started, but food itself was cold, and warming effect was gradual rather than immediate. As crew moved about, handling gear, organising ship for day, their bodies began generating heat through activity. Muscles working produced warmth. Blood circulation increased with movement, bringing warmer blood to cold extremities, fingers, toes, ears, nose. Acute cold of first waking began to diminish as body warmed itself through work. Day's sailing plan would be discussed among senior crew members, wind conditions assessed from feel of air on exposed skin and from observing water surface. direction determined by sun position if sun was visible, or by continuing previous day's heading if clouds obscured it. Sail would be raised or adjusted, steering oar would be positioned. Ship would transition from its night mode, stationary or drifting focused purely on survival, to its day mode, active, moving, making progress toward destination. Night had been survived. Each man had made it through cold hours. No one had frozen. No one had suffered serious hypothermia. System, tent, wool, leather, shared body heat, watch rotation had functioned as designed. Crew was intact, capable, ready for day's work. Hewed fat that had been warm refuge was now just leather chest again. Tent fabric that had created enclosed dormitory was now folded bundles of wool stowed for daytime. Shields that had been walls were now spray protection and martial display. System that had protected them through darkness was dismantled, its components returned to their daytime functions. But knowledge remained with every crew member. Tonight, if they were still at sea, system would be rebuilt, tent would be raised once more, hood fat would be unrolled, furs would be laid down, watches would be assigned, meal would be eaten, and sleep would come again, protected by same materials, same methods, same collective warmth that had worked countless times before. Vikings knew they could sleep without fire because they had proven it repeatedly. Each night survived reinforced confidence in system, in materials, in crew's ability to endure. Night just past was one of thousands stretching back through history, all proving same principle. Fire was not necessary for survival at sea. Wool, leather, and human warmth, properly managed, were sufficient. The motion of ship was constant. Even when anchored or drifting, even in relatively calm seas, the vessel moved. The flexible hull rose and fell with each passing swell, twisted slightly with each wave that approached from angle, settled back as each wave moved on. This motion was transmitted to everything aboard ship. Deck boards moved. Tent fabric swayed. Sleeping men moved with ship, their bodies shifting in response to changes in angle and acceleration. For someone unfamiliar with ships, this constant motion can be deeply disturbing. The inner ear, which governs balance and spatial orientation, sends signals to brain indicating movement. But eyes, seeing enclosed space of tent, send signals indicating stillness. This sensory conflict causes motion sickness, nausea, dizziness, disorientation. For experienced sailors, this conflict is resolved. Vestibular system adapts to ship's motion, learning to expect it, to process it as normal. Brain stops interpreting movement as problem requiring attention. Motion becomes background, no more disturbing than feeling of sitting in chair on stable ground. This adaptation is essential for living aboard ship. Without it, sailors would be constantly nauseated and unable to function. Adaptation occurs relatively quickly, usually within few days of being at sea. Vikings, who spent significant portions of their lives aboard ships, were thoroughly adapted. Ship motion was simply normal for them. For sleep, motion had specific effects. Rocking of ship is similar to rocking of cradle. Gentle rhythmic movement promotes sleep in infants, and effect extends to adults as well. Motion activates vestibular system in predictable, soothing pattern. Rhythm of rocking was tied to wave period, time between successive wave peaks. In open ocean, wave periods might be 6 to 10 seconds. Each rise and fall of ship then occurred on this timescale. This is slow rhythm, similar to rhythm of slow breathing. Correspondence may create synchronization between body's breathing rate and ship's motion, form of entrainment that promotes relaxation. Motion also required subtle muscular engagement. Even in sleep, body's core muscles remained partially active, making small adjustments to maintain position on moving deck. This low-level activity is automatic, controlled by cerebellum and spinal reflexes rather than conscious thought. Engagement prevents sleeper from rolling across deck or colliding forcefully with neighbours. Sleeping position affected how motion was experienced. Lying with body oriented perpendicular to keel meant motion was primarily side-to-side roll. Lying parallel to keel would emphasize pitch, bow rising and falling. Most sleepers chose perpendicular orientation because it allowed them to brace against ship's sides or against each other, providing stability. Flexibility of ship hull was crucial to quality of motion. Rigid hull would transmit wave impacts as jarring shocks. Flexible clinker-built hull absorbed wave, energy through flex, creating smooth rises and falls. Motion was gentle, not violent. This gentleness was essential for sleep. Harsh, sudden movements would wake sleepers repeatedly. Gentle, predictable movements allowed sleep to continue. Rocking also provided a form of passive warmth generation. Muscular activity required to maintain position, though subtle, burned calories and generated heat. Metabolic cost was small, but in an environment where every source of heat mattered, even this small contribution had value. For a person trying to understand Viking sleeping experience, imagining motion is important. Modern beds are still. Body at rest on modern mattress experiences no external movement. Sleep happens in stillness. Viking experience was opposite. Sleep happened in continuous gentle motion. Body learned to rest while moving, to find stillness within motion. This capacity to sleep while moving extended beyond just ships. Vikings were travelling people. They slept on horseback during long overland journeys, on wagons in temporary camps. Ability to rest in less than ideal conditions was survival skill. Ship, despite its motion, was not most challenging sleeping environment they encountered. It was simply one of many. Rocking of ship, then, was not obstacle to sleep, but component of it. Motion was expected, familiar, and in some ways conducive to rest. Combined with warmth of wool and fur, security of watch system, and exhaustion of day's labour, rocking became part of rhythm that carried crew through night. The North Atlantic remains grey in winter. Water still holds same cold. Wind carries same chill. Darkness falls with same completeness. Fundamental environment has not changed since Viking Age. What has changed is how humans respond to that environment. Modern ships have steel hulls that require no flexing. Engines power through storms rather than waiting them out. Heated cabins with electric lights replace wool tents. GPS and radar replace star navigation and experienced reading of sea conditions. We can call for help via radio, track weather systems via satellite, avoid worst conditions entirely through planning and technology. Vikings had none of this. They had wood shaped by axes, wool from their own sheep, leather from their own cattle. They had accumulated knowledge passed down through generations, refined through countless voyages. They had heat their own bodies generated and materials to conserve it. With these seemingly simple tools, they crossed oceans, discovered new lands, and maintained trade networks spanning thousands of miles. Their success reveals something about human adaptability that remains relevant. Solutions they developed were not crude improvisations or desperate measures. They were sophisticated technologies, refined over generations, representing accumulated wisdom of seafaring culture. Wool came from sheep, specifically bred over centuries to produce fleece with particular properties, water-resistant tog and insulating thell working together. Weaving and fulling techniques created fabric that was simultaneously windproof, water-resistant and insulating. Leatherwork produced sleeping bags that were waterproof, durable and effective. Every element represented specialized knowledge. Psychological adaptations mattered as much as physical tools. Learning to sleep in constant motion. Learning to trust ship's flexibility rather than fearing it. Learning to accept proximity of others as security rather than intrusion. These were cultural practices, transmitted through childhood experience and apprenticeship, as important as any piece of equipment. System worked because it addressed fundamental problem correctly. Problem was not absence of heat. Human bodies generate heat continuously through metabolism. Problem was heat loss. Every element of sleeping system focused on preventing loss rather than creating warmth. Tent stopped wind, eliminating convective heat loss. Wool trapped air, preventing conductive loss. Leather blocked moisture. Shared sleeping arrangement pooled heat. Nothing added warmth from external source. Everything worked to preserve what body produced. This principle, working with what you have, conserving rather than generating, appears throughout Viking maritime practice. They did not fight sea's motion, but built ships that moved with it. They did not attempt to heat their environment, but dressed and sheltered to retain their body's warmth. They did not struggle against darkness, but simply accepted it as condition during which rest happened. Night aboard winter longship was not pleasant by modern standards of comfort. It was cold, damp, and cramped. Sleeping surface was hard despite furs. Air smelled of damp wool, leather, unwashed bodies, and tar. Sounds of water and wood continued ceaselessly. But it was survivable, and survival was measure of success. Crew members who woke each dawn had achieved something significant. They had spent 8 or 10 hours in sub-freezing conditions without any external heat source and remained healthy enough to work ship. This achievement, repeated night after night across voyages lasting days or weeks, enabled travel during seasons when others stayed in port. Modern cold-weather gear reflects these same principles. Sleeping bags that trap body heat in insulated envelope, layered clothing systems that create dead air spaces for insulation, materials that maintain function when damp. Vikings understood these concepts empirically, through observation and experience, without benefit of thermodynamics or material science. Watch system that ensured continuous vigilance while allowing crew to rest appears in maritime traditions worldwide. Specific rotations and procedures varied, but principle remained constant. Ship requires attention, so rest must be organised to maintain that attention while allowing recovery. Communal sleeping arrangement, sharing of warmth, acceptance of proximity. These were social technologies. They required trust, cooperation, and mutual dependence. Crews that shared these cold nights developed bonds that strengthened their effectiveness not only aboard ship but in all aspects of Viking society. Story of Sleeping on Winter Longship contains no dramatic conflict, no heroic struggle against overwhelming odds. It is simply story of people managing cold, using available materials, applying accumulated knowledge, and surviving to sail another day. But that survival, repeated across thousands of voyages, across centuries of Norse maritime activity, was foundation that enabled Viking Age itself. Explorations that reached Iceland, Greenland, and eventually North America all depended on ability to travel by sea in conditions that would have stopped peoples without this refined cold-weather maritime technology. Trade routes that connected Scandinavia with British Isles, Frankish Empire, Byzantine Empire, and eventually regions as distant as Middle East, all relied on sailors who could function through winter conditions at sea. Specific challenge Vikings faced, sleeping without fire on open boat in freezing temperatures, has been solved by modern technology. We no longer need to rely on wool and leather and shared warmth because we have synthetic insulation, portable heaters, and enclosed cabins. Problem, from modern perspective, no longer exists. Yet something remains worth remembering in their solution. They worked with their environment rather than trying to dominate it. They used renewable, biodegradable materials that could be produced locally and repaired when damaged. They organised socially to share resources and support each other through hardship. They adapted their bodies and expectations to conditions rather than demanding that conditions conform to their preferences. Hoodfat and tjald, wool cloak and watch system, stockfish and communal warmth. These were not merely survival tools. They were complete approach to living in harsh environments, approach proven sustainable over centuries. As dawn broke over Longship each morning, as crew emerged from their sleeping bags and began work of another day, they were not reflecting on historical significance or cultural achievement. They were focused on immediate concerns: wind direction, distance remaining to destination, condition of ship and supplies, work that needed to be done. But in that simple continuation, sleeping, waking, sailing, lies everything essential about Viking maritime survival. System tested over generations, proven over countless voyages, refined through accumulated experience, allowed them to do what seemed impossible: rest and recover aboard open boat in winter conditions that could kill unprotected humans within hours. They slept not through exceptional physical toughness or supernatural endurance, but through knowledge and preparation. They survived not by fighting their environment, but by understanding it and responding appropriately. They woke each morning ready to continue not because night had been comfortable, but because it had been survivable. And survival, sustained over time, was victory enough. Grey ocean stretches on through winter. Cold remains. But knowledge remains as well. Knowledge of how to sleep when fire is forbidden, how to rest when cold surrounds you, how to wake ready for another day's work. Vikings proved it could be done. Every night they slept aboard their ships without freezing, they proved it again.